Welcome to the May 2017 Nutritionist webinar. I am Miriam Fessenden from AMTS and your English language host. These webinars provide access to technical seminars by internationally recognized speakers. The series presentations are held in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. Marcos Neves Pera from Universidade Federales de Lavras will be hosting the Portuguese language presentation with Marcos Hens Ramos from 3R Lab facilitating. Paula Torillo from Argentina is hosting the Spanish language webinar. There will be a question and answer period immediately following the presentation. Listeners can submit questions from me, Marcos, or Paula. A complete recording of the archived webinars as well as a question and answer session for each will be available on the AMTS website. Very pleased to welcome Dr. Ian Lean today for the May edition. Ian's general interests are in improving the profitability of ruminant production. He is the managing director of Scibus, a company that conducts research and consults to dairy and beef producers within and outside Australia. Ian has extensively published on the interactions of nutrition and production, reproduction, and health. He has been a keynote speaker at numerous international conferences presenting on those topics as well as on meta-analysis and study design. He has researched transition physiology, metabolism, and management for 30 years and has worked on impacts of integrated nutritional strategies on health production and reproduction. Since 1990, Ian has also been active in discussing the implications of increasing population on food availability and the roles of technology and activism in addressing these. He has a deep knowledge of factors influencing farm profit and biological and economic perspective. Ian serves on numerous boards and committees. He has been a faculty member at both the University of California, Davis, and the University of Sydney, and continues on as an adjunct professor there. He is the president of the Australian Cattle Veterinarians and recipient of the Gilruth Prize, Australian veterinary profession's highest honor. I feel a bit like a time traveler, as it is Thursday morning where Dr. Lean is. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to him. Dr. Lean, you are unmuted, and very shortly you will be in control. There you go.
Well, look forward to presenting this, and as many of you will recognize, any body of work that you present has a lot of credit for a lot of people, and I just want to acknowledge my co-workers and co-authors down below, and I'm particularly excited that we've got so many people involved in producing some of the work that we're going to show. And really, we're going to talk a little bit about practical applications, and we're going to talk a lot about the theory as well, so that people can get a deeper understanding of the factors involved in managing transition. So there's two key goals today. I do want to keep it practical and touch on some of the ways in which we can practically manipulate transition feeding, and particularly using a hazards analysis critical control point, or HACCP approach. There's some very simple tasks, and my assumption is that many of the attendees are going to have high-level skills in these areas, so we are going to touch on these, albeit briefly, but we're going to also drill down on some of the information that has formed the basis for these approaches, and particularly to talk about some of our newer understandings about the physiology of the period, and to really try to drill down and understand why transition is such a pivotal event for the cow. Also, I want to just touch briefly on some aspects of pasture, because applying good transition diets in pasture-based systems is much more complex than in TMR systems. So in thinking about that, really, it's important to say that the transition period basically commences about 4 weeks before calving. It incurs about 80% of the disease costs and incidents that occur in adult dairy cattle. It there's a peak period for deaths and involuntary culling. And lastly, it determines a successful lactation. So, as everybody listening undoubtedly knows, this is the time where we really need to put some emphasis on doing things right. It really doesn't matter whether you're in a TMR system or whether you're out at pasture. The nutritional directions have to be the same. Pasture is a much more complex system and raises some particular challenges in regard to how you apply these programs. But the principles are exactly the same across the two systems. So the bottom photograph actually is of a pasture herd. These are the Springer mob in transition a couple of weeks before calving. And what it shows is that we have down below a group of cows being fed on a strip of pasture such that we can control the amount of pasture that they're eating. So it's really about exercising the same control. This is a slide showing some data from one of our earlier studies looking at risks of removal by sale or death and the hazard for removal. And what you can see is that both removal in terms of getting cows that are necessarily culled or cows that actually die peaks at around the time of calving, and of course the voluntary removals peak towards the end of lactation as we get rid of cows that are not pregnant or cows with other health problems. So again, it just re-emphasises the importance of the early lactation period. So the aims of the transition period are simple. The first one, and I'm not going to dwell on this today because it is an important topic, but it's a topic in its own right, is to adapt the rumen to feeds of higher energy density. In all systems, we take cows from lower energy density diets to higher energy density diets as we take them through transition, and that incurs increased risk of acidosis. And acidosis affects dry matter intake, and therefore it's a critical task in terms of our management to control the risk of acidosis. The second aim is to prevent the risk of disease. The third is to provide a live calf, and the fourth is to provide the basis for a fertile and productive lactation. So it's not just about preventing disease, it's actually forming the basis for an effective lactation subsequently. Critically, you need to establish 4 freedoms. The first is to be free of macro mineral deficiency, conditioned or not. So a conditioned deficiency is one in which another mineral, for example, increases the risk or decreases the risk of mineral deficiency. So the classical case is the case of calcium, in which we know both potassium and magnesium play pivotal roles, but more of that later. The next, and this is a very interesting space, is to be free from lipid mobilization disorders. And there's a number of tasks we need to address to effectively control the risk of lipid mobilization disorders. And a lot of this seminar will look at the relationship between the lipid mobilization disorders and hypocalcemia. We also need to be free from marked immune suppression. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this topic because it's, again, a very complex and lengthy topic, but it's an important one. So we need to be free from marked immune suppression. The typical periparturient relaxation of resistance that occurs in ruminants, we need to control. And lastly, we need to be free from rumen disruption, and we've already talked about that in terms of acidosis. But one of the other critical areas that influences rumen disruption is the feeding of poor quality feeds. And we'll just talk about that a bit later too. If we look at some targets, we can actually set some health performance targets that might help us understand whether we've got a problem or not. And probably the most critical way to evaluate whether you've got a problem is to look at the incidence of disease. It's probably the most powerful monitoring tool we have. I think often we reach for the metabolic tools. We go to measuring, for example, the prevalence of hypocalcemia or the prevalence of ketonemia, and we imbue those things that we measure with a lot of value, but critically, the things that we really want to measure are the performance outcomes in terms of disease. And these often help us understand whether we're doing a good job or not, much more so than some of the metabolic measures. So these are the targets. We've got a low rate of milk fever, a very low rate of clinical ketosis. Abomasal displacements can be quite challenging at times. We really are targeting quite a low rate there. Mastitis, lameness, hypomag. We should never see that in modern herds. Retained placenta, metritis, calving difficult, and clinical acidosis. So those are the alarms that we've set and the targets we've set, and they've been adopted in Australia as standard targets. So if we look at our hazards analysis critical control point, it's important to recognise that nutrition is not the only area that we're actually trying to address. And first things that we need to look at are some of the other areas of management covered. So our animal health protocols up to date and executed, for example, dry cow treatments for mastitis, vaccinations and parasite control. Environmental challenges managed, stocking density in groups and strings. Again, excessive movement in that period can upset cows. You've got to be aware of the social hierarchy, and you've got to work towards minimising the number of moves that occur in these animals prior to calving. Next, the feed bunk. Make sure that the food is being prepared properly if you're dealing with a TMR system and that you're not getting a build-up of poor quality feed. It's critical to keep the bunk management high. And lastly, weather. Both heat and cold and wet can cause problems. So heat much more so in TMR systems, but also when animals are at pasture, and cold and wet, especially when animals are at pasture or when they're in open corrals. So these things need to be considered. And lastly, if you're going to monitor the outcomes of transition, you need to be recording them. And the question is about masking is, are you routinely using treatments, for example, oral calcium drenches or using injectable forms of calcium at calving on every cow? Because then you don't understand whether you're increasing your risk or managing hypocalcemia properly or not. I'm not advocating not using those products, but I'm saying that it's often very hard to identify then whether you're getting a hypocalcemia or not from your nutritional strategy. So we're going to start almost at the end rather than start at the start. In a sense, we want to know if these strategies are critical, and if they're important, then we ought to be able to see observable effects of integrated dietary intervention in the transition period. So I'm going to look at a couple of studies that I've been involved with that at least give us an indication of the importance of transition. So the first one was published in the Australian Veterinary Journal back in 2008, and it was a study with Peter de Garis. And what we did was we looked at the opportunity to study the length of time cows were on a transition diet and the impact it had on performance. So this is not a randomized controlled trial, but a prospective cohort study, which is a very robust form of study, but it gives us the opportunity of seeing if a cow was exposed for a longer or shorter time to a transition diet, what was the impact on her future performance? So these were the herds we used. We used 3 herds, and we had 3 different diets. And herd 1, the things to highlight there is that we had, I guess, a MP balance here of minus 72 in one herd, but plus 400 and plus 530 in the other herds, with a mean of about 286 for a positive metabolizable protein balance. The ME balance, and this is in megajoules of ME per kg, so for those of you in the US, divide by 13.88, you can look and see that these animals were in a positive energy balance. They would have been gaining on that basis approximately about a half a kilo a day of body weight, exclusive of the fetus. So they were basically probably losing a little bit of energy to the fetus. So the crude protein of the diets was about 14, 16, and 17.5%. And the NFCs were around 21, 32, and 29% in the diet. So if we look at the minerals, we put the minerals together as best we could at the time. And this was before we did some further work, and I did that work with Peter, on the calcium optimal mineral balances for these pre-calving diets. And when I look at these calcium balances, for example, we probably advocate now a target of about 0.65% for calcium in the pre-calving diet. But the most notable change that we would advocate is that we increase magnesium to about 0.45% of the diet. Note that the diets were negative DCAD, so that we had a negative dietary cation-anion balance, and those were around 200 milliequivalents per kilo and as low as 35 milliequivalents per kilo per day. Looking at the responses, the longer an animal spent on the transition diet, the greater the milk production. Now, this was out to day 150 of lactation, but what it said was that the cows out to day 150 of lactation did 29 litres a day on average if they were fed for about 25 days versus around 25.5 if they only got about 5 to 7 days of exposure to a transition diet. So these data are corrected for lactation number of the cow, for the farm and the calving order, so that it corrects for any length of gestation issues or any other factors that might have influenced the outcome. So it's suggesting that for at least 150 days of lactation, we're getting around an extra 4.5 litres of milk per cow per day, which is a pretty profound difference. So the question is that milk simply lactose and driven by water, or is it in fact milk solids? Because in many of our production systems worldwide, we're now paid for milk solids. Well, the impact is about the 0.12 of fat if, again, these cows are fed for about 25 days of lactation. Interestingly, there does seem to be a curvilinear response in regard to lactational responses. They tend to drop off. And again, milk protein yields, again, quite a large difference. It's more like 0.13 kgs of milk protein per day as those cows are put on the longer period of exposure prior to calving for the transition diet. So these animals spent 25 days on a transition diet before calving in those transition diets that you saw. And again, the data are corrected for parity, length of calving order, and also for the gestation lengths. So the next study is one that we've done in conjunction with Jose Santos and his co-workers over in the University of Florida. And this is a collaboration between the two groups, and it's Natalia Martinez and Rachel Rodney, who are the students who have led this work. So in this case, we wanted to explore the response of transition cows to vitamin D source and to DCAD of the diet. And in this study, we've used oral calcidiol and a negative or positive DCAD to explore the responses of the cows of 79 cows and heifers after calving. So the targeted period for the exposure was 21 days prepartum. A common diet was fed from calving to day 49 in milk, and the diets were balanced for metabolizable proteins. So what you had here was a negative DCAD and a positive DCAD, cholecalciferol and calcidiol. And these diets were very carefully balanced to ensure that we had a very good comparison between the groups that really just reflected the effects of DCAD and source of vitamin D. And in this study, it was a 2-by-2 factorial design, so a randomized controlled trial. In this study, we took blood samples regularly every 3 days, and we looked at vitamin D metabolites, minerals, calcium, osteocalcin, cross-slaps, leptin, adiponectin, and PTH. And we took milk samples, and the yield and composition was recorded weekly for the first 49 days in milk. So these papers are in preparation now, and what I'm going to show you are some of the data that have already been presented at the American Dairy Science Association meeting last year. So disease was monitored daily to 30 days in milk. So the milk production responses are pretty interesting in this study. We have a significant effect of vitamin D. We didn't get a significant effect of DCAD, though there is a numeric effect and some interesting interactions, particularly in multiparous cows. So, feeding calcidiol increased milk yield by nearly 3 litres a day, and milk solids, fat and protein, by 0.25 kgs a day. So really quite a large effect. It tended to increase milk, fat and protein yield by 0.14 and 0.11 kg per day. Now, the interesting thing is that we saw different responses in heifers and cows, and this is, again, a similar pattern that we'll explore later in this talk, where we saw quite marked differences between the responses in heifers and cows to DCAD diets as well. So, the interesting thing is an interaction between the multiparous cows, where those cows that were fed a negative DCAD and calcidiol produced 7 litres per cow per day more than the cows that were fed a positive DCAD and cholecalciferol. And it was very clear in this study that a positive DCAD was a really bad thing to do for cattle, and it was also very clear in this study that we saw very good responses in terms of health to calcidiol. So the interaction of negative DCAD and calcidiol increased over positive DCAD and cholecalciferol milk solids yield by 19% in cows and 11% in heifers. So we saw some very good production responses again in terms of integrating sensible nutritional diets in transition animals. What about reproductive health? Are these things influenced by transition diets? Well, we know that milk fever, for example, is a really devastating disease. There was some great work by Chuck Curtis and Hollis Erb out of Cornell University in the early 1980s that really delineated a lot of this. But we can see when we look around the world that there's a lot of evidence that milk fever or hypocalcemia is a gateway condition that governs a lot of the responses around that early lactation. So it's an important part of early lactation. If we have a look at milk fever and reproduction, you can look at calving to first service for the cows with milk fever, calving to conception, services per conception, and we can look again down at metritis, and we can see that cows with metritis also have significant problems. So if we look one stage further and we say what happens to an animal that has milk fever and metritis, well, then we end up with a really poor result. So we get extended calving to first service, extended calving to conception, and a marked increase in services per conception. So these data came from the UK, from Borsbury and Dobson. Looking now at the next slide, we can look at some work done in the US by Martinez and Santos, and we can have a look at that work and see what happens when you have hypocalcemia rather than milk fever. If you look at cows with hypocalcemia versus normocalcemia, you can see that in fact there's already a relationship between metritis and calcium status, so that cows that are hypocalcemic had 3.2 times the risk of metritis versus cows that were normocalcemic, so that the metritis milk fever link are not independent. In fact, they are dependent. And in terms of severe puerperal metritis, there was an 11.5 times the risk evident. So you find that very few cows with normocalcemia had a severe puerperal metritis. And again, puerperal metritis and metritis both have significant negative impacts on the future performance reproductively. So again, just looking at some more data to re-emphasise, milk feeder cows 8 times more likely to get mastitis, 3 times more likely to suffer from dystocia, 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from retained placenta, and 2 to 4 times more likely to develop displaced apomasum. I think the compelling message is that we do have a significant reason to control hypocalcemia and milk fever in the periparturient period. So these cows also had longer time to pregnancy and required more services per conception. Again, looking at some responses to an integrated transition diet, this is some work Bob Corbett did on an 8,500 cow dairy, and what you can see is that the number of cases of milk fever, retained placenta and uterine infections dropped markedly with increased exposure to a transition diet. So again, prospective cohort, commercial large dairy, and in the US, and again, compelling evidence of the potential for an integrated transition diet to reduce the risk of disease. In our own studies in Australia, we also saw a very marked reduction in culling. It was one of the reasons why we were intending originally to look at production out to day 180 in this study, but we had to terminate at day 150 because we were seeing such a markedly different risk of culling and removal for cows that had a shorter exposure to the transition diet. So you can see the cows that were exposed to the transition diet in those Australian studies for either 0 to 10 or 11 to 20 days had nearly double the risk of removal for culling or death compared to the cows that were exposed for greater than 20 days. So again, substantial evidence that we do alter the health and well-being of cows by effective transition diets. So significantly less culling or death. Moving on now to reproduction, and this is really, I think, quite an exceptional figure, because when you couple this with the milk production data and the milk solids production data, remembering that the cows that were exposed for a longer period to a transition diet, they had a marked increase in production, and yet what we can see here is that they have a very much better performance in terms of reproduction. Now, for those people who understand a pasture-based system, they'll also recognise that those cows would have had a shorter time from calving to the start of mating. So these were done in a seasonal calving system or a split calving system, and what that means is that the later you calve, the less time you have to prepare for the start of mating. So despite these cows having a shorter period to initial mating, they've actually got pregnant far, far better. So what you can see is you've got less than 8%, you've got an approximately 8% difference in the total number of cows pregnant. That was not significant. But what you do have also is an increased rate of getting pregnant of 1.5% per day. So just to translate that, if a cow was on for an additional 20 days the transition diet, what she would have then is a 30% greater probability of getting pregnant every day during the breeding season. So very substantial increased rate of pregnancy in these cows, and what you can see is that, for example, to get 50% of the cows pregnant, it took a lot less days. If you look across there, you can see that the difference is about 15 days to getting about 50% pregnant. So a really beneficial effect in terms of reproductive performance of those transition diets. So these are good things, but the question that we can raise is, how do we actually change the future? How do we keep improving on this performance? what do we need to do to make it work better? And this is where we start to drill down a little bit and try to understand some of the responses that we've seen, and also to try and hone those responses. So we need to understand and refine our approaches to managing transition, and the key areas that we're going to focus on today are the roles of skeleton and the roles of protein in achieving a better transition performance. So pre-calving interventions that can have a long effect on milk production and reproduction and lactation. So one of the questions that I've asked myself is, how is it that we can do something for, say, 20 to 25 days before calving and get a response for 300 days subsequent? And what are the types of interventions that have given that sort of result? So if you look down, the first one that we've talked about is calcium and vitamin D and effects on metabolism. So the physiological basis for this is the upregulation of metabolism through skeleton. And we're going to talk a fair bit about that. We've got examples that show, both as randomized controlled studies, increased production with negative DCAD, and we're going to explore that a little bit more later. We've also got an increase that occurs if we reduce nutrient demand pre-calving or increase energy or protein intake. So examples of that is this rather interesting study that Hind et al. Put together in 2014, where we see increased production for cows that give birth to heifers. Certainly there's anecdotal evidence also that Holsteins that are bred to Jerseys give more milk in the next lactation. At least Holstein heifers bred to Jerseys. Jersey bulls give more milk in the next lactation. Hormonal intervention, RBST given before calving, increases milk production for about 30 to 40 days after calving. There's also these fascinating studies done by the Italians, Bertoni et al., and then in America by Farney et al., looking at increased milk production of cattle treated with salicylic acid. So treatment prior to calving or just around calving with salicylic acid resulted in prolonged responses that were positive in terms of milk production. But the focus of today is really on calcium and vitamin D and its effects on metabolism and how we might be able to understand it a bit better. So we've drawn a fair bit on some work out of the mouse area, and some very elegant studies driven by observations of the interaction between obesity and bone mass and density in the humans. Ducey noted differences in bone mass and density from obese humans. And what they were able to do then is drill down on that work using mouse studies. So they developed some very elegant studies using mouse knockout models. And so Carcenti and others started to look at a bone-specific hormone, osteocalcin, and realized that it did things in terms of energy metabolism. So it impacts on insulin sensitivity of peripheral tissues, influences adiponectin concentrations, beta cell proliferation in the pancreas, osteoblast proliferation and differentiation, and increases bone deposition. It also influences leptin. So we're going to look a little bit more at this specific hormone. So osteocalcin exists in one form, which is the standard osteocalcin, but under the influence of acidification in particular of the bone, it translates, or it undergoes a carboxylation or a partial carboxylation into an undercarboxylated form of osteocalcin that is supposed to be more effective than osteocalcin itself. So there's an upregulation of osteocalcin. And this figure comes from a paper looking at the role of osteocalcin in human glucose metabolism. And it's saying, is it a marker or is it a mediator? So we're going to drill down a little bit on the role of skeleton in terms of what it does in terms of controlling milk fever risk. And I guess for me, it's been a bit of a revelation. I always thought of bone as being a relatively passive part of the body, but what we're increasingly seeing is bone as a very active part of the body. So this figure basically shows these interactions around osteocalcin. So what you've got is an osteocalcin gene producing osteocalcin. And osteocalcin undergoes a vitamin K dependent carboxylation, and it especially undergoes it under the influence of acidification. So what you get is acidified lacunae in the bone where the osteoblasts produce osteocalcin. And what you can see here is it's influenced by diet. Diet influences and changes bone turnover, and we can create a metabolic acidosis. The interesting thing about this undercarboxylated or uncarboxylated osteocalcin is, as we said, it influences at least the male sex organs, it influences the pancreas, it increases muscle sensitivity to insulin, it increases adiponectin production, and that in turn feeds back onto bone. So there's a positive feedback mechanism. It plays a very important role in this axis. So if we think about this right-hand side of this, we can see that we've got this interaction between things that we develop in the diet and mediate in terms of bone health and productivity in terms of potential to manipulate and integrate metabolism. So why is vitamin D important? Why are we looking at things like calcidiol? Well, calcium metabolism plays a vital role, clearly. Vitamin D metabolites are essential for calcium absorption from the GI. There's a lag time in response that comes about, and vitamin D might help us with that lag time. With skeletal metabolism, we've got increased calcidiol with PTH stimulates resorption of bone. Sorry about this, I'm just not getting a move on that next dot point on the slide. I'll just come back up and hopefully that'll break it down. And of course it influences energy metabolism that we've just talked about. So that's why vitamin D is important. It promotes insulin release and sensitivity. Now for a long time we've thought that the cow is insulin insensitive around calving, and it is. But perhaps these mechanisms give us the opportunity to overturn that, because the actions of osteocalcin increase insulin secretion, increases insulin sensitivity of the peripheral tissues, stimulates adiponectin production, beta cell proliferation, and that then gives us an insight to the homeoretic responses. So the homeostatic responses around calcium are one thing, but we're very interested in the homeoretic responses. How does metabolism integrate over such a dynamic period as the calving period? So that's, again, an insight to where the role of skeleton may be critical to integrating metabolism. And we're going to see some data in a minute to support that. Insulin inhibits osteoblast activity and increases bone resorption. And when the lacunae are acidified, we get increased decarboxylation of the osteocalcin. So adiponectin also can play a potentially important role. And the reason this is critical is that we have been able to link in the past, work by Claude Hoyer, where we've seen that cows that are fat, high levels of adiposity, result in greater risk of milk fever. So the linkage between the fat in a cow and the risk of hypocalcemia possibly reflects these links between osteoblast function and adiponectin, and then back to the lipid deposition. So adiponectin increases osteoblast proliferation and differentiation. It increases bone deposition. It increases glucose uptake in peripheral tissue again, and it may suppress hepatic ketogenesis. So, looking at now the left-hand side briefly, the remarkable thing about this particular axis is it has classic feedback mechanisms. These classic feedback mechanisms go through the brain through neuropeptide Y, neuropeptide mu, and they feed back to provide a complete link between the brain, bone, skeleton, and transition. So, the question the mouse guys asked was, why would a bone-specific hormone regulate energy metabolism? Well, partly to adapt to demand in a fluctuating feed environment. Gestation and parturition, reproduction in general, is a highly risky business. So adaptation to demand in a fluctuating feed environment allows upregulation and downregulation of metabolism and support of the calf. In other words, positive signals around diet, positive signals around metabolism can be reflected in increased milk yield. Successful species that adapt to that risk may have adapted through this mechanism in part. The mechanism provides for homeostatic control of calcium, but it also provides for homeoretic controls of energy, protein, and other nutrients, and perhaps reproductive risk. So, moving on to just see whether it actually has effects. This is some rather elegant work again done by the Florida group. And what you can see here is that they have induced a hypocalcemia in these cows. So what you've got now is blood calcium and plasma calcium. You've got ionized calcium and you've got total plasma calcium. And you can see that the cattle that have an induced subclinical hypocalcemia have a markedly lower blood calciums. So what's the impact of that? Well, there's several impacts. The first is that with an induced hypocalcemia, you get a change in the response. So normocalcemic cows are able to maintain higher plasma insulin than cows with an induced hypocalcemia. Again, blood glucose is lower in the cows that are normocalcemic because they have the increased production of insulin. You've got also a change in plasma NEFA, which is really quite a quick response in regard to this. So there's the infusion period, and straight away you can see that the animals that are subclinically hypocalcemic are increasing their mobilization of NEFA. So again, very consistent with the data that we've seen out of the murine work. Now, if we look at concentrations of blood metabolites, and this is a subpopulation out of Peter DeGarris's work, if we look at this, we can see that in fact you've got cycling of calcium in the cows that had the longest exposure pre-calving. So this calcium cycling event had been recognised by the Scandinavians, and it appears to indicate that there is a feedback mechanism active in terms of controlling blood calcium. So, just looking forward on that, we were able to take that data and do what's called time series analysis on that data. And what that allows us to do is look at the relationships between, for example, in this case, calcium and NEFA on the same day, but also over time with lags of about 3.5 days. So each lag, -1 for example, relates to the relationship between calcium concentration 3 days earlier.
For those of you listening to this as a recorded presentation, during this time period we experienced some audio interference that totally drowned out Dr. Lean's voice. I have edited out portions where we cannot even hear him. As follows, for a very brief period of time you will hear some outside noises. I've taken out chunks where he is overwhelmed but left in where we could hear it. I apologize for this inconvenience.
Okay, so with that we can see that in fact there's a negative relationship between calcium and NEFA, again observed in these cows, that supports the studies of Dr. Santos and others over in Florida. But more importantly, we can see that in fact calcium is having a positive effect on NEFA. So what you're finding is that if the calcium levels are high 3 days before, the NEFA are low. The NEFA are high, but in fact if they're low but the calcium and NEFA feed back on the same day to release. So, if we have a look at the total relationships between calcium and NEFA, we can see that they're in fact very strongly related, both on the same day and on different lags, indicating that there is a feedback mechanism on that. So the first thing that you want to do is understand that there is a hierarchy involved in the nutrition of the animal and, of course, the metabolism of the animal. So what you have is the genetic merit basically sets the agenda. The genetics of the cow is critical, and of course, as we all know now, what happens to that cow subsequently in terms of epigenetic change also is critical. So those two factors, the nutrition and the age and the previous lactation events, are really important in setting that cow up as it comes into the transition period. They establish the internal fluxes of metabolites that are available. So, in other words, the amount of fat, the amount of lipid, the amount of other nutrients such as the specific fats, such as minerals and vitamins, all establish body tissue reserves that are then added to by transition nutrition. So the transition nutrition makes available increased nutrients to supply that internal flux for cows after calving. But also, of course, what you've got then is the subsequent lactation nutrition and the transition nutrition establish the dry matter intake of the cow after calving. That then allows for the nutrient flux that occurs that sends the metabolic signals to the cow and the crosstalk between metabolites, hormones, and metabolic signals we've talked about in the context of bone. So it makes sense to kind of consider this hierarchy that then influences hypothalamic pituitary responses, ovarian function, and of course fetal maintenance. So when we start to now think about this HACCP analysis type approach, what we can find is that that construct here helps us understand how we influence transition effectively. So our second HACCP point in terms of practical nutrition is about establishing optimal body tissue reserves. We look for a body condition score of 3.25 to 3.5 out of 5, and the second part about that is considering whether that body tissue contains excessive adipose tissue or whether it's down to fat. So the sort of two-step transition diet that we do is very much designed towards an optimal period of transition, and that's been established in several studies. But if you've got a high prevalence of fat cows, it may be better to take them through on the sort of diets that have been advocated by Jim Drackley and others in the US, where you control the caloric intake for an extended period. So that's a possibility. This is some well-muscled cows. They've got adequate adipose, but they're well-muscled cows approaching parturition. So you can see that this cow doesn't have excessive levels of fat either over the back or between the hooks and the pins. There's some fat covering, but it's certainly not excessive, so well-conditioned cows. On the other hand, these cows out of the UK are well over-conditioned. There's massive amounts of fat evident by the amount of fat deposited over the back there, and the hooks and the pins are deeply covered in fat. So we know that those cows are in increased risk of periparturient disease. And early work by Emery and repeated by others now showed very clearly that the cows of greater or equal to 3.5 body condition score had much lower, greater than 3.5 body condition score, had much lower dry matter intake than those that were less than or equal to 3.5. So body condition score certainly determines appetite, and appetite is a key part of control. So the third HACCP point is really, are you feeding the cow enough? And this just doesn't come down to allocating feed on an ad hoc basis, but ensuring that the cows are actually eating, and that all comes into the bunk management, but it also comes into, in pasture-based cows, making sure that the allocations are sensible around pasture and that competition, particularly between older cows and younger cows, is controlled. So the golden rule really for transition is to maintain appetite. This is such a pivotal part of managing the parturition period that it's critical. So in other words, making sure that cows are not inappetent through any cause over that period. And things that cause inappetence are obviously impacts of dominance behaviour. There's things such as off feeds. There's things such as failure to eat because of adverse environmental conditions. And one of the ones that we see as a major cause of hypocalcemia, which is the impact of poor quality silage. So poor quality silages are a major problem. So if we look at it and just wonder why that lipid can be a problem, what's the role of lipid, what's the interaction with calcium, it's worth thinking about the way that in which cows get lipid. It's essentially acetate and butyrate uptake that goes into the adipose tissue, forming triacyl glyceride. So you've got 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol chain. And what you've got then is that under the influence of insulin, you get increased deposition. But of course, under the influence of glucagon, adrenaline and growth hormone, or the IGFs, what you get is mobilization of those triacyl glycerides, and they move into the body tissue. Of course, the other way that we get fats out of the diet is as long-chain fatty acids, and these are transferred across into adipose tissue. But of course, subsequently, as we mobilize around parturition, what we get is fatty acids moving into the bloodstream and then going down as long-chain fatty acids through the blood. The fate of these is very important because it determines liver health, it determines function. So we're just going to look at the long-chain fatty acids coming across, deposited in the cytosol initially as long-chain fatty acyl-CoA, moves across through the mitochondrial membrane, the long-chain fatty acyl-carnitine, and down for beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. So as long as beta oxidation is occurring and as long as acetyl-CoA is being combined and taken out through the Krebs cycle, what we get is, of course, a source of energy that is oxidized and utilized by the animal quite effectively. So under periods of negative energy balance, animals are able to cope well with that mobilization of tissue, provided these things happen. Provided we get propionate coming up to methylmalonyl-CoA and succinyl-CoA. We also have a benefit if we've got a good mobilizable supply of amino acids, because most of the amino acids are aminogenic or glucogenic amino acids. So glucogenic amino acids allow us to produce glucose, potentially in combination with acetyl-CoA. So what you've got is the potential then to take the acetyl-CoA and use it effectively in combination with the flux of propionate, typically from feeding starches or high-quality grasses or high-quality silages before calving that can supply propionate. If we look then, if we don't have enough flux coming up from propionate, what we then get is transfer of the acetyl-CoA into acetyl-CoA, and then subsequently into acetoacetate, acetone, and into 3-hydroxy or beta-hydroxybutyrate, that is then a soluble form of energy that's transferred to the peripheral tissues. It's important to understand that ketones are not necessarily bad. They can be very positive. So if we look then at the points of control, the major point of control is the transfer across the mitochondrial membrane, and it's carnitine acyltransferase 1 that does that. So that's an important thing that controls it. So my point about ketones is not to always regard ketones as being negative. Here's some data from 1994 that we did looking at cows with clinical ketosis, cows that are ketogenic or non-ketotic cows. And what you can see is that the cows that are ketogenic and maintain dry matter intake actually ended up producing more milk than any other cows in that study. So that ketones aren't necessarily a bad thing, providing the animal is able to cope with ketones. However, ketosis itself, where the animal is not able to maintain its feed intake, is a negative. How do we control that? Avoid poor silages, avoid excessive body condition score, ensure that you've got adequate feed intake after calving, check cobalt and phosphorus levels in the diet, control milk fever, and we've talked about that, avoid excessive bypass protein or low crude protein diets, niacin, fats in particular, oral propionate salts and propylene glycol are all beneficial, and ionophores are particularly effective at controlling risk of ketosis. And this is the data published with Todd Duffield and myself and Ahmed Rabi in the Journal of Dairy Science, just showing the profound benefit from monensin in terms of controlling the levels of ketones in blood. So what that shows is that monensin is effective at controlling ketosis. So key message is to put body condition on in the previous lactation and to try and control body condition and maintain it, but not excessively gain it unless cows are in poor condition during the dry period. So to be free from the lipid mobilization disorders, the key steps are muscle, not lipid, negative DCAD, which links the calcium to lipid metabolism. So again, providing a negative DCAD diet, controlling ketosis. Ketones are not necessarily bad, but it's important to control the generation of ketones and to ensure that you're not getting lipid deposition into the liver. And alternative approaches, as I said, such as the approaches advocated by people like Jim Drackley, are probably useful when you have high prevalence of fat cows. So, HACCP number 4 really comes down into feeding the right things. It's getting the diet right, energy, protein, fats and minerals, and asking the question, is the feed safe? You need to be aware of mycotoxins and bad silage, and is the cow comfort and care right? So these are the recommendations I've got for dietary strategies around the far off, transition and for fresh cows. And really it's saying that for far off cows, NDF down around above 36, transition around 36, for fresh cows down to 32 with a physically effective NDF of about 19. Crude protein 14 to 16 and a plus 200 grams of metabolizable protein seems to be around the ideal level. Again, crude protein after calving, somewhere between that 16 to 19, but maybe as low as 15 if you can finesse that in tightly controlled systems. Certainly in pasture-based systems, we're likely to be above this level. In terms of the estimated energy, metabolizable energy, I'm going to just do a quick conversion for the Americans so that we've got 0.73 NEL per pound, we've got 0.80 NEL per pound and 0.88 NEL per pound. So the energy density increases over that period. Ether extract, 4 to 5%. If you've got protected sources, you can even increase it. Calcium, we're recommending 0.4 to 0.5, but I'd even increase that to 0.65. Phosphorus, control the phosphorus and the magnesium, and then DCAD milliequivalents per kg is less than minus 80. So, steps to achieving higher dry matter intake. The obvious, make more feed available. Surprising how many people don't do that though. Control competition and ensure comfort. Increase the digestibility and manage the protein needs, and control body condition. They're all the key steps to ensuring higher dry matter intake in the cows. So, I just want to revisit one of the other methods for increasing productivity and reproductive performance after calving, and that's to just briefly revisit protein effects on production and fertility, looking at some recent work we've done on this. It provides some interesting insights in regards to cows that fail to adapt and fail to get pregnant. So, looking at protein nutrition and genetic merit on production, we're looking here at these variables over here being pre-calving body weight, pre-calving plasma or amino acid nitrogen reflecting protein status. We're looking again at MP balance prior to calving, amino acid nitrogen, cholesterol, amino acid nitrogen and body weight. And we're looking at the impacts of these on milk yield, milk protein yield, and milk protein percent. And this is in 82 cows in a 2x2 factorial where the cows have diets that differ in degradability of protein, and the cows differed markedly in genetic merit. And what you can see is in regard to milk yield, genetic merit was significant, diet was significant, but significant covariates were also body weight prior to calving, as you might expect, and also amino acid nitrogen, indicating that cows with more amino acid nitrogen in the bloodstream were cows more likely to produce milk, a significant amount of milk in the first 150 days after calving. Milk protein yield followed a very similar pattern, with striking differences between genetic merit and also the different diets. But what you find there also is that metabolizable protein balance was a positive for milk protein yield. But interestingly, when you come down this way, you start to see, when we look at milk protein percentage, no impact of genetic merit, no impact of diet, but what we find is that the anabolic agents or anabolic factors such as body weight, amino acid nitrogen and cholesterol all had negative effects on milk protein percentage. So looking at this a little bit further, what we can see is that the cows that were on the better protein diet, more degradability, less degradability, had much better pregnancy to first service rate than those with a higher degradability diet. So we can also see very little difference according to genetic merit. And of course, as you might expect, the calving to pregnancy interval was shorter for the cows that were on the diet that contained more protected protein. So those diets were isoenergetic, isonitrogenous, and extremely similar in all attributes, apart from degradability. If we look at milk protein percentage in fertility, we now start to find some interesting results. And these results, I guess, have been indicated by now quite a number of workers. And what it shows is that, in fact, diet had no impact on the hazard or the probability of getting pregnant. Genetic merit had no effect when we took into account milk protein percentage. So milk protein percentage acted as a confounder. And what we find is that cows that had the lowest percentage milk protein, or the lowest quartile, had a markedly impaired ability to get into calf. So if we look at that, we can see that the cows with the lowest quartile of milk protein really struggled to get in calf. And this probably reflects cows that have been either overstimulated to milk or cows that are unable to cope with the pressures of producing large amounts of milk or milk protein. So let's get down to some of the nitty-gritty and let's talk a little bit about how we prevent milk fever. We've talked a bit about it, but what we're going to do is talk a little bit about some of the background understandings. So these approaches to preventing milk fever are based on a meta-analysis that we published back in 2006. And what we can see is we asked these questions. What equation should we use to calculate DCAD? And what about controlling calcium, magnesium, phosphorus intake prepartum? Is urine pH important? If so, what are the target values? So we asked these questions. We ended up with this equation. And this equation predicts the risk of milk fever. And what you've got here is you've got calcium as a linear and a quadratic effect. You've got magnesium. You've got DCAD in the equation that you've got. So milk fever risk increases as a linear effect of calcium, but decreases as a quadratic effect. Magnesium is highly protective, and as DCAD increases, so does risk of milk fever. So if we look at magnesium, we can see that in fact the effect is pretty profound. As we increase the amount of magnesium in the diet, you can see that the risk of milk fever decreases markedly. So we've calculated this risk at a level where the risk is relatively low, but what you can see is as you go from 0.2%, you go to 0.4%, you've more than halved the risk of milk fever. If we look at the impact of calcium, we find this strange quadratic effect. And to be honest, I really wasn't looking for a quadratic effect of calcium when we did these data. But at the end of the day, the data speak for the data. And I think now there's quite strong evidence that this occurs. So as we go from basically 0.5% calcium in the diet to about 1.2% calcium in the diet, we markedly increase the risk of milk fever. Again, the risk more than doubles as you go across there. Interestingly, however, if you go from about 0.5% over to about 2.25%, the risk of milk fever is the same. Does that make sense on a physiological basis? Well, yes, it does. The bottom line is that you see that risk simply because you see this risk profile simply because you're stimulating two different mechanisms. At the low calcium, you trigger PTH release and active uptake of calcium mediated by vitamin D. At the high rate, you overwhelm the active systems and get passive intake of calcium and can control the risk of milk fever. But it would be simplistic to think that transition was all about simply controlling risk of milk fever. So it's important to understand that it's about much more than controlling risk of milk fever, but it's important to understand that there are two ways to control risk of hypocalcemia. So if we look at milk fever risk, we also find, and this explains why the American workers have tended to cling to higher calciums, is that if you use about 1% calcium, you have a high but relatively constant risk of hypocalcemia. If you use a low amount of calcium, you have a very low risk of hypocalcemia, but if you feed it for a prolonged time, your risk sneaks up. The most diabolical thing to do is feed high rates of calcium for a short period before calving. This almost inevitably results in milk fever risk, especially if you have an underlying high rate of milk fever. So phosphorus also reduces the risk, increases the risk of milk fever as it's fed in the diet. It's not a dramatic effect, but too much phosphorus in the diet is a problem. Now, if we look at that effect of exposure, the longer that animals stay on a transition diet, the more the risk is of milk fever, which sort of argues for doing the two diet approach to controlling milk fever. Now, importantly, and this was a source of confusion before this study, DCAD has a linear effect on milk fever risk, so that you can see that as you go from 80 milliequivalents per 100 grams, or 800, down to half that, 400, you approximately halve your risk of milk fever. If you look at plasma impacts, DCAD has a non-linear effect on blood pH, and importantly, it also has a non-linear effect on urinary pH. So if you're monitoring urine pH, there is very little difference in urine pH between a DCAD of 800 and 400, but you've halved the risk of milk fever. It's not till we get down to the negative DCADs that we significantly reduce the risk of milk fever, reduce the urine pH, but by that stage, we've really markedly changed the risk of milk fever. So in one sense, the importance of urine pH is to tell you whether you are effectively feeding a negative DCAD diet. It is not very diagnostic for your risk of milk fever. So I want to just touch on the particular challenges of pasture in regard to transition management. The first problem is dominance of cows. We can't control precisely the amount that cows get. And consequently, if we're feeding pasture and we're feeding other feeds, it's very hard to control which animal gets what. However, we take a number of steps to try and control that risk. And why is that risk so important with pasture? Well, these are data from the Dairy One Forage Lab for ryegrass. And what you can see here is that when we look at about 6,000 samples of ryegrass, the average DCAD is 440 milliequivalents. It is very difficult to control a diet with 440 milliequivalents of DCAD and achieve a negative DCAD diet. Consequently, we control the amount of pasture that goes into cows prior to calving. If cows are calving on the pasture, we genuinely like them to get pasture before calving, but we use strip fencing, other feeds to limit the amount of pasture that a cow gets, and typically we limit the pasture to about 3 kgs. It is critical because these grasses, the ryegrasses and also the tropical grasses such as kikuyu and Bermuda, are very nitrophilic. They like to take up nitrogen, but they also take up a lot of potassium. So areas that are highly fertilised, and especially areas that are exposed to effluent, should never be fed to cows. Simply, you will get feeds that have got DCADs of plus 700 and 800, and they're impossible to control. So, just summarising some of this, to be free of macro mineral deficiency, key steps: keep appetite constant, prevent milk fever, have high magnesium in the diet, calcium limited to about that 0.64, 0.6 to 0.65, control potassium, and feed for approximately 21 days. And increasingly, we think that the role of vitamin D metabolites may be critical. So the DCAD equation that we ended up using was the one that was developed by Elliott Block in about 1984, and that's simply this milliequivalence of sodium and potassium minus chloride and sulfur over 100 grams, and that reflects the strong iron model, the simplified strong iron model that ultimately boils down to this strong iron difference determining metabolic acidosis. So, metabolic effects of negative DCAD diets, metabolic acidosis in goats and cattle has been established in a decreased renal sensitivity to PTH. In cows fed a positive DCAD diet, you see enhanced renal production of vitamin D, active vitamin D, in response to a low DCAD diet. You see increased responsiveness of target tissues to 125 hydroxy D3, the active D3, with increased calcium absorption from the GIT, increased resorption of calcium from bone. You see calciuria, excretion of calcium. One critical point, practical point, is that if you see cows that are producing, that are going down with milk fever prior to calving, it's often a good indicator that you've effectively acidified the diet and that those cows are excreting too much calcium. It's really worth going back and checking the calcium in the diet to make sure you've got it right. And lastly, increased plasma-ionized calcium concentrations, and that's been observed quite a few times. So Elliott Block did this wonderfully elegant study recently, Jesse Goff did this wonderfully elegant study quite recently, and which they basically fed cows a low DCAD or high DCAD diet and looked at the response of parathyroid hormone. And what you can see is that the cows fed the high DCAD diet basically have what Jesse terms an induced parathyroid hormone deficiency in response. So basically what you've got is a failure of PTH to respond in cows with a positive DCAD diet. So I think we're a long way to understanding the effects of DCAD. And a summary of these things is that you get a powerful effect of magnesium. Calcium is a quadratic which interacts with the length of time you feed it. DCAD's important. Urine pH monitoring is less important than monitoring feed. If you get the feeds right, then you should achieve that negative DCAD, and you should achieve a negative, a low urine pH. pH is around 6.5, 6 to 6.5. And those cows, that indicates not the risk of milk fever, but it indicates that you're delivering your DCAD diet properly. Understand that the protein percentage of the diet as it goes up can increase risk of milk fever. Age and parity, the older cows have a 9% increased risk of milk fever at each calving. DCAD's important. It reflects the strong iron difference. It influences production, and protein is important. So we're going to talk a little bit now just about the data that shows what DCAD does in terms of milk production responses. But if we take a low DCAD versus a high DCAD, high calcium diet, this is why we favour a low DCAD and low calcium diet. What we get is increased PTH release, increased TTH response, increased vitamin D responses, increased GIT uptake of calcium, increased ionised calcium in the blood, increased calcium mobilised from bone, and probably increased decarboxylated osteocalcin, compared to a high DCAD, high calcium response where we get lower PTH release, lower PTH responses, lower vitamin D responses, and those vitamin D responses we're increasingly recognising are important for immune responsiveness. More passive GIT uptake of calcium, but little calcium mobilisation, and unknown effects on osteocalcin and energy metabolism. So this is briefly a study published in Animal Production Science. It's a paper that contains much of the discussion that we've gone through today, and it just basically shows the DCAD responses. It's a meta-analysis, all the world data on DCAD and milk production responses. And what you can see is that overall, you get increased milk production with a negative DCAD diet. So that's a positive response to decreasing DCAD in the diet. However, it's not a homogeneous response, and it reflects a much greater response in multiparous cows than primiparous cows. So if you look at multiparous cows only, we can see that they are producing about 1.2 litres additional milk per day as a response to a negative DCAD diet. But if we look at the heifers, the heifer responses indicate, in fact, the opposite, a loss of about 1.5 litres. It's important to note that some of the studies in this particular group of studies are actually poorly executed. And the more studies, which are very substantially negative, have problems in study design. In fact, if you take those out, you find that the effect is effectively a null, no response. Now, the interesting thing about that is that in Peter de Garris's study, where we exposed the cows to an integrated transition study, the animals that responded best were the heifers. So I think the message is, perhaps if there's two separate diets and the possibility to do that for the heifers and the cows, you may not want to include a negative DCAD at this stage. But overall, if you've got one diet to feed, then a negative DCAD diet is definitely the preference, as there appears to be no harm in heifers once you take out the study of more. So, DCAD summary: lowering of DCAD of pre-calving diets increased milk production in multiparous but not primiparous. Both result in high levels of heterogeneity. So there's stuff around this that we still don't understand yet. And that's where the refinement of these strategies is so important. While treated cattle did not have a low DCAD on average, only minus 2.3 or 23 milliequivalents per kg, the difference in DCAD of the control or DCAD of the control group were not significant covariates. So there's more to uncover in this story. The NDF of the diet was a significant covariate, suggesting that diet may influence DCAD through non-mineral pathways. There's a lot of unexplained variance in those responses, and more work's required to understand them. So I'm just going to really, really briefly now start to wind up. And the first thing now I want to touch on is this freedom from marked immune suppression. So the key steps in summary are muscle, not lipid, negative DCAD and vitamin D, quite profound effects in terms of benefiting immune suppression, so overcoming it, sensible antioxidant management, trace elements, vitamins, and energy and protein are always the most important players in establishing a good immune response. And just looking at this very complex diagram from Margaret Curtis and myself, and there will be an exam on this later. I am kidding. If you look at this interval from calving to conception, you can see that there's a lot of factors that influence the time to pregnancy. And what you can see back here is the impact of metritis. You can see the impact of dystocia. You can see uterine time to uterine involution. But what I wanted to point out was that things such as albumin, body condition score, copper zinc superoxide dismutase, vitamin A, and glutathione peroxidase all played a part in controlling risk of disease. So it's important to understand that mineral nutrition is integrated as part of an integrated strategy because these things interact in very complex ways. And the bottom line is that just one magic bullet, such as increasing selenium or such as increasing vitamin E to really high levels, is not an appropriate approach. It's actually integrating these antioxidants into a package of sensible supplementation. I want to briefly touch on fats. This is in fact another whole lecture, but I do want to touch on this recent study we published, Rachel Rodney and myself, and it basically shows a very profound impact of fats on the probability of pregnancy. And I want to encourage people in non-pasture systems and even those using pasture systems to carefully consider the effect of fats in terms of dietary structure. And the reason I want to do that is that supplementation with fats increased the probability of pregnancy by 27%. So what's that mean? The probability of pregnancy in the controls was 50% without fats. Then with fats, it would be 63.5% pregnancy. Importantly, this was all the world literature that we could pull out appropriately, but we also saw this trend when we evaluated the studies with valid interventions but poor dietary detail. So the studies that were rejected really supported the studies that were in the meta-analysis, and it's really compelling evidence that fats need to be considered when you do transition diets. There was a very low heterogeneity on this study given complexity. So in summary today, the advantages and disadvantages of transition feeding are: there is planned and structured increased labour and time needed to take the feed cows and the diets for transition. You have to set up a special transition diet. The advantage, however, is markedly reduced labour and less time spent on treating cows. Time's freed up during the calving periods for other tasks, e.g. colostrum management. Animal health: there is the risk with any technology that increases production to increase risk of mastitis. Other diseases, however, are markedly reduced, and we do have some exciting data to produce out of those Florida studies I talked about in terms of disease reduction. Milk protein production or production itself, you need the feed to support the performance. And I think that's really the key message out of the Rachel Rodney study recently published in 2016 on pre-calving protein. Too much protein, metabolizable protein pre-calving, ultimately had a negative effect. However, it's important to point out that the predominant effect was positive. It was only when we started to get up to very high levels of prepartum gain of metabolizable protein that there was a negative effect. But it emphasizes the point that if you stimulate the cows to produce by good transition management, you need to support them with good postpartum management. Lastly, profit. These things are very profitable. Bottom line is we estimate returns at least of 10 to 1 for investment for producers, and so we think these things are profoundly beneficial, and we really support the use of transition feeding. So lastly, I just want to thank the people who supported us. Dairy Australia and involved, Scibus, our own company, supported it. University of Florida, Dairy New South Wales, Church and Dwight, DSM, and the University of Sydney also provided support along with the University of Florida. So I want to thank you all for your attendance. You've been heroic hanging in there through some background noise and chatter, and if you've got any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for a great presentation. I'm going to do a couple things that I need to do, introducing next month's presentation and thanking our sponsors. Firstly, I would like to remind you to join us next month for Dr. Sam Fessenden, our newest member of the AMTS team. Sam joined AMTS in October 2016 after having completed his PhD at Cornell University, working in the Van Amberg Lab Group. Despite his youth, he has been actively involved in the CMCPS model research for more than 10 years. In his undergrad years at Cornell, Sam worked with the group that was primarily focused on revising nitrogen and carbohydrate analysis and degradation. His master's work with Dr. Marshall Stern at the University of Minnesota focused on fermentation through continuous culture fermenters, providing him with a strong understanding of rumen fermentation. Sam's PhD work was focused on amino acid supplies in lactating dairy cattle. In addition to independent consulting, Sam now works for AMTS as technical support and Euro-Asia sales. His talk will focus on integrating data collected from on-farm programs into nutrient models to improve predictions and cattle performance. Due to travel complications, Sam will present on June 7th, the first Wednesday of the month, at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. To thank the people who make this possible: Tom Taluki and AMTS USA and Global, Marcos Neves Pereira, University of Lavras, Marcelo Hens Ramos at 3R Lab in Brazil, Paula Turillo in Argentina, and our translator at each location, and it's always a challenge for them. We have generous sponsors that make it possible to get great speakers and manage the program. We thank our gold sponsor, Ajinomoto Heartland, Superior Nutrition through Amino Acids. Our silver sponsors are Arm & Hammer, Animal Nutrition, R&D Life Sciences, Virtus, makers of Strata with EPA, DHA, omega-3s, and Prequel with omega-6s, Cumberland Valley Analytical Services, Dairy One Forage Laboratory, and Dairyland Laboratories. Our bronze sponsors are Jeffo, Life Made Easier, Adiseo, Amino Max, and Quality Liquid Feeds. I will open the floor up for questions. Remember, for the English language speakers, please type your questions in the question and answer window or the chat window. I monitor both of them. And with that, I'm going to start with at least 3 questions from our audience in Brazil. So first of all, I know that Marcos and Marcelo will thank you, Dr. Lean, for your presentation, and sorry that they can't talk with you directly. The first question is, when using negative DCAD diets with anionic salts, keeping the calcium low, less than 0.6% of dry matter, or high calcium, greater than 0.9% of dry matter, which are you recommending? And
I recommend
there's
about a 0.6 to 0.65 for the calcium. Now, the reason that you see some of the slides with a little lower concentration is that we've snuck that up over time, because we found that if you went down to 0.5 or 0.4, sometimes if cows were on a negative DCAD diet for a long time prior to calving, they would go down with a very mild form of milk fever prior to calving. Those cows always responded well, got back up, were healthy, but it was an indication that the calcium excretion in urine was greater than the calcium going into the system. And of course, especially in pasture systems where we've got less control over which cows get what to eat, you've got that increased risk. So we're recommending that 9.65. as you move to 0.9, you could see on that slide that there was a very markedly increased risk of milk fever. So you don't want to increase that risk of milk fever or indeed hypocalcemia. So staying down around that 0.65 is the way to go.
Okay. Dr. Lean, if you want to go back to certain slides, I can give the presentation control back to you, and you can actually go through your slides and find them. I'll do that. And there was a second part of that question.
Oh, I apologize.
Oh, no. It's good to break it up. Does the DCAD value of the diet determine ideal calcium concentration? And stimulation of the parathyroid with low calcium is beneficial on negative DCAD diets? ?
Look, I think it is, and that really reflects some of those things that Dr. Goff did in that very elegant study. It's really the capacity of PTH to respond, and I think that what you get is that if you do go the other way and you do kind of go to that higher DCAD, you're suppressing that PTH response. So I think that again, it's a better place to be on those low DCAD diets with lower calcium. So you get the stimulation of PTH from two different ways. You get that ability of the cow to respond because it's in a negative DCAD state, but you also get the response through vitamin D upregulation. And now that we're looking at some of these really nice studies by Corwin Nelson over at Florida, you're starting to see just how profound the effect of vitamin D is on the immune system. So I think we're at a point where we can, really comfortably say that we should be doing that particular strategy. So the low DCAD, the low vitamin D is definitely the way to go.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, low calcium is definitely the way to go. This is the slide I wanted to bring you back to.
Very good.
If you go here and you look at that factor there, you're at about a 3% risk, somewhere around a 3% risk with that 0.9, right? You go back to 0.65 and you're at approximately half the risk. So you've halved the risk of hypocalcemia. And if you've got just remember that these models that I'm using for the example slides are based on a low milk fever risk diet. Okay, so the potassium's quite low, the sodium's quite low, the DCAD is low. Now, if you amplify that and you've got your potassium high, you've got your DCAD high, you've got your magnesium perhaps lower, you could find that halving is a difference, say, between 6% and 3%, not just 3% and 1.5%. So you've got to remember that it really amplifies as you go up. So that's why it's critical to stay in those safer ranges and not to explore those higher ranges.
Okay. My next question, and I just managed to close my questions and Word is not responding. Wonderful. Here we go. My next question from Marcos is, could you comment on the use of high versus low energy intake prepartum as a way to affect liver metabolism and the effect on milk yield and reproduction?
I think there's a lot to do in this area. I don't have an unequivocal answer at the moment, but there's a couple of points I'd make. If we think about that construct about the hierarchy of events, making sure that those cows have adequate reserves of energy and protein that they can mobilize prior to calving is critical. So that the first thing is get to that ideal body condition score. Now, if you're overconditioned, there's no doubt that controlling the intake of nutrients is beneficial. We've seen that out of the work of Jim Drackley and others, and we've got an interesting study out of New Zealand from John Roche's group where controlling intake to 90% of requirement seemed to be beneficial. So there is some evidence perhaps to suggest in our own work recently where too much MP before calving had some adverse effects. So I think there's evidence to say that being around the requirement for the cow and the fetus is probably the right place to be. But At this stage, it's somewhat equivocal. There's no doubt that if you're in a low body condition score, reproductively, you're going to be less successful. So cows that are less than a 3 are probably going to run into trouble. Cows that are more than a 3.5 are again going to run into trouble. But the more profound loss for producers is with underfed cows. Cows that come in a poor body condition, they have problems of anestrus, they have lower pregnancy rates to service. So what you've got is, I guess, a balance. Don't overdo it, but don't underdo it, because underdoing it is far worse than overdoing it. So in terms of error, it's probably better to have cows slightly over condition than under condition, but certainly oversupplying energy, oversupplying protein are not beneficial. So I think it's a real message around precision.
Okay. I have two more questions from Marcos and Marcelo right now, and then we'll go to some questions from Paula. The next question is, does the calcium content of the postpartum diet and how fast cows are moved from the prepartum to the postpartum diet act as a factor on definition of the ideal calcium concentration in a prepartum transition diet?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't know that it's really been tested. I can't give you a scientific answer based on data, but what I can say to you is that one of the big errors that occurs in pasture-based systems is a failure to supply adequate calcium after calving. And certainly, I've seen in Argentina and, Australia, I see it only rarely ever in the US, but there is a problem if you put these cows immediately after calving onto a diet that is insufficient in calcium. So the recommendation around 0.8 to 1% for that diet immediately post-calving is a sensible recommendation. Putting them down onto an inadequate calcium diet, especially when their appetite is not high, because remember, it's really about total nutrients intake. We often talk about percentages, but we're much, much better off talking about grams of intake. So if you don't get adequate grams of intake to meet that increased demand for the mammary gland, you're going to make bad mistakes. So bottom line is that I can't tell you about the speed with which you move it on to, but it is absolutely imperative that cow, as soon as it calves, go onto a diet that is far higher in calcium. It needs to have it available because the upregulation should have occurred with your transition diet to allow that intake, and it's vital to provide it. Cows are really interesting with regard to calcium. They are really able to grab more calcium if it's available. There's marked differences in absorption percentages, but it's also very clear that those cows are sometimes inappetent, and getting total calcium in is crucial.
Okay, thank you. And then the final one that I have right now from Marcos is has it been really defined that the use of transition diets prepartum can increase mastitis?
No, it's simply a consideration that mimics the effect, for example, of BST or higher milk production per se. So that the transition diet per se may not be the factor, but increasing production either with cows of higher milk production or cows that are stimulated to produce more milk with BST, these animals have higher risk of mastitis. It is therefore very likely that stimulating increased production using a transition diet is likely to increase that risk of mastitis. But if you put together a well-integrated transition diet and you had a poorly integrated transition diet before, my guess is that you may even improve mastitis. So it's not the transition diet per se, but the increase in production associated with the transition diet.
Okay, we're going to try and see if Paula can talk. So I'm going to unmute her mic, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to having her type it in the question. So Paula, go ahead.
Thank you, Ian, for the presentation. I have a couple of questions here. One from Danielle. When you talk about vitamin D supplementation, Was it oral or by injection? And which is the recommended dose? And when do you suggest to make it?
Okay, so they're good questions. At the moment, the form of vitamin D that we've been exploring is calcidiol. That's 25-hydroxy D. That form is the storage form of vitamin D. We think that the dose we used in the Florida studies was 2 milligrams per cow per day prior to calving. And so at the moment, because those studies were very effective, that'd be my recommended dose.
And regarding vitamin D also, those cows in the study, were they grazing?
The Florida study, no, they were not grazing their TMR. So the diet was very tightly controlled. At the moment, we're doing some work to have a look at transition diets in grazing cows, and we hopefully will be able to give you some information soon.
Dr. Lean, I know that if we get some more research done on grazing, that there was a lot of interest in it in our audience out there.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's great that people are interested in it because it's an interesting production system. It's much more complex than TMR systems, and I'm glad that people are raising questions around the practical implementation of transition and feeding in those pasture-fed cows.
Yes, I have a question from Melina. What would be your recommendation if our dry cows are already fat, recognizing they shouldn't?
Right, yeah. Look, again, the recommendation is to control nutrient intake. We don't want those cows now to lose body condition because that's extremely negative. And what it tends to do is with those cows, it does tend to deposit lipid into the liver. And when you start getting lipid into the liver, if you get enough, it has pretty severe effects on liver function. So you need to make sure that they can maintain their appetite, but again, give them feeds of lower energy density. So you might want to take my recommendations back a half a megajoule, say, to 9.5 megajoules of ME per kg. So just tweak down the energy concentrations because you don't want them to gain weight. You do want them to eat high quality forage, and it's really important to put the best quality forage in front of those cows you can, because in those circumstances, any off feeds will be devastating. So the critical thing with those fat cows is to keep them eating. So they will naturally have a lower dry matter intake, as you saw from the data of Emery. It is critical to tempt those cows to keep eating and maintain their body condition as they go through. So it really is, I would term, an emergency situation. It really requires attention to detail, and it's important that that detail include the same sort of mineral and vitamin and protein recommendations we've got, but it's also critical that it not include an energy density that is too high. So it's a little bit of a case of more bypass protein, less rumen degradable protein. Why? Because as the energy density drops, you won't form as much microbial protein. So it's critical to integrate those aspects. And again, you know, just coming back to the strategies used by some other people, Jim Drackley's type strategy where you're using a bulky feed such as an oat hay or a barley hay, those sorts of things, you know, well processed will work well. Be careful of some of those hays. If the awns, AWNS, the awns on the hays are sharp. Again, we just don't want animals not eating. So look carefully. I would tend to use an oat rather than a barley or wheat because of that.
Yes, I have another question from a group from Uruguay. What is the recommended potassium percentage of the pre-fresh diet?
Yeah, look, I look at the potassium in reference to the rest of the DCAD. So again, you know, that sort of 1.6% is probably around where you want to be, but most critically, it is to have a negative DCAD of about -100 to -200 is about ideal.
Eileen, I know you talked a bit, and I confess I don't get to listen as well to these as I should, but can you talk a little bit more about vitamin D?
Sure. The vitamin D is a critical part of the active absorption process for calcium, but what we're now recognizing, and I guess it's been recognized particularly in the more basic science literature, is that vitamin D plays an incredible number of vital roles in metabolism. And foremost among those are roles in terms of immune responsiveness. So what we're able to see now is that the immune system is very much upregulated in animals or humans with adequate vitamin D status. And one of the problems that we've had is that for a long time we knew that vitamin D analogues were very useful in trying to control risk of milk fever. And, for example, there was an injectable 1-alpha hydroxylase type vitamin D that was used on the market for quite some years in a number of countries. So it was an injectable that had to go in between 2 and 8 days prior to calving. And that product worked extremely well if you hit the right window, that 2 to 8 days, but in fact would increase the risk of milk fever under other circumstances. So that we've known that all sorts of different analogues of vitamin D have been important to reduce the risk of milk fever, but also to increase the health of animals around calving. But up till now, we haven't had effective analogues that we could use safely. And so now we've got a window into, I guess, an effective analogue that we can use potentially safely, and that then gives us some rather nice results. So, without preempting some of the papers that are coming out too much, I can say that the use of the calcidiol, particularly with with the negative DCAD, resulted in marked improvements in health. And so what we've already seen from the Degaris study and from the Corbett study was marked improvements in health were evident. But what we can also see now is that with a randomized controlled trial, we've even improved on that. So I think we're now looking at a situation with the sort of strategies we've got of really reducing the risk of disease in these animals, and that's an incredibly positive direction. So, that's kind of where the vitamin D stuff is at the moment.
Thank you. Paula has a question, and then I do have a question from Ken Zalari. So we'll let Paula ask her question.
Another question from Melina regarding vitamin D supplementation. Do you think that the effect of the calcidiol supplementation is because the diet was deficient
in vitamin D?
I cannot read. Was deficient in precursors, or is there some metabolic problem to produce the vitamin?
Gee, that's a good question too. Look, these animals would apparently be adequate in vitamin D, the controls, but I think it's clearly the form of vitamin D that then upregulates the event. So I think the answer is that this is a response that goes to restore the vitamin D status of the animals towards that animals might achieve in summer. We've now looked at their vitamin D status in plasma, and it's very obvious that there is a marked fluctuation between winter and summer, and that's even in sort of moderate areas like Australia, where we're seeing differences in concentrations in the winter and summer that are nearly double. So I think if we look at the response, we're probably above the highest of the animals that were tested in summer with no background, and we're higher than Bill Weiss's study in the US, where he also looked at vitamin D status in animals. I think therefore that it's probably a little bit of an above physiological benefit. So I would say that the animals may have been marginal on vitamin D, but it appears that we're giving a benefit above normal levels.
Okay. Dr. Lean, I have a question from Ken Zanzalari. He said, you made it clear that you recommend low DCAD and low calcium to stay away from a positive DCAD diet, whether it be with low or high calcium. What about a low DCAD and a high calcium? And he's saying 180 to 200 grams.
Yeah, and I guess this is the one that really probably needs testing. My view is that the summary here that I've put up covers this question, I think, reasonably well. But the low DCAD, high calcium, I think you've still got the opportunity here of not upregulating your vitamin D responses. Now, you may be able to overcome that another way, and that might be by supplying vitamin D, as we've just discussed. But if I look at this, I go, well, I would like to upregulate my vitamin D. And I think that's going to occur, well, I know that's going to occur because of the studies that have been done, with a situation where you go with a lower rather than a higher calcium. So I see no real benefit of going with those high calcium strategies prior to carving.
Yes, another question from Danielle. Comparing two fresh cow systems, A, having fresh cows grazing a high quality forage, but maybe not having much time to rest, or B, having them under a TMR diet with hay, moderate quality hay. Which one would you prefer?
I think it's horses for courses, and it's about the economics. You know, ease of management, I'll take a TMR system. They're much easier to manage, much easier to be precise. But if it comes down to good quality pasture-based grazing and a nice farm, I'll take that pasture-based farm because it works extremely well managed. The big problem with the pasture-based farms in Australia, and it's evident also in South America, is we've moved up to much larger farms. The difficulties of managing grazing herds is extreme. Therefore, the sort of approaches that I've seen in Argentina in the past, where they limit the grazing herd to 400 cows and have them going through different sheds, is a great way to go. I enjoy both systems. Again, your key comment is around the ability of cows to rest. If those cows have to walk a long distance to get pasture and they're not getting rest time, if there's a lot of competition for the pasture space, if you're not getting all the cows there together and there's heifers missing out because the cows are getting to the pasture an hour sooner and they're eating a lot of the pasture and the heifers don't get as much, then your TMR system's a better system for cows. But it's really about the quality of management you can execute in a pasture-based system. A well-run pasture-based system's a lovely system. So, it's about the specifics of the circumstances.
Okay, I have another question from Ken Zanzalari. Is it the low calcium diet or the acidification or both that stimulates conversion of inactive vitamin D to active vitamin D through PTH? Therefore, both may be working and are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, I think that comes back to this figure here. So here's your PTH upregulation or normalization with a negative DCAD versus the positive DCAD. So Jesse Goff's work, really says, well, the low DCAD does that for us and it allows that PTH to upregulate. So I think the low DCAD thing's critical, but we go back to the older work in regard to the high calcium prior to calving, and it goes back to UK work in the 1950s and 60s. And really, some of those guys showed, and I think Ward was one of the workers, and those studies very clearly showed that there was a depression in vitamin D formation with the high calcium diets. So those high calcium diets are definitely suppressive of vitamin D. I don't know whether a negative DCAD can normalise that situation. To me, it's actually a burning study that needs to be done. So I really appreciate the question because, it goes to the heart of some of the things we ought to explore. Because I know people cling to those high calcium diets, but at the moment I think the evidence is pretty strong the other way, but I'm really keen to see somebody do that study. I think it's worth doing.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lean. Ken says thank you, and I have a question potentially. Let me see. Sorry. I have a question, I think, from Razak Balogun, but I need him to type it in the chat window or the question and answer window. But I think we are winding down. He raised his hand. So that's what... I
can see his hand up. It's
I know. So let's see if we get something, but not to put him on the spot. But I know that Marcelo and Marcos in Brazil were thankful for you to join us. I love it that we're talking to you tomorrow. That just makes me happy. These webinars are fantastic because I think we get a fairly broad spread of where we're getting people joining us from. And although ours tend to be mostly Western Hemisphere, but I know that we do have some people who are probably pretty tired at this point joining us in the middle of the night. So
I figure, yeah. It's a late show.
It is. Let's see, Razak, if you can type something in, that'd be fantastic. He can hear me, but I can't hear him. I'm always hesitant to let people speak because it's a lot of can you hear me? But let's just give it a go.
Okay.
Hello, Razak.
I've typed. Hello, Marianne.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I've actually typed my questions, but for some reason you're not receiving them.
I'm sorry.
So I don't know what's going on.
Okay. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Maria. Thanks, Dr. Lane. That was a great presentation. I've got two questions. These are just feedback from what I hear from farmers, especially with regards to DCAD high calcium. Some are talking about going the high calcium, which essentially likely going to be high DCAD, and they reckon they're getting good result. My question is, can you make up that by ensuring you have a good nutrition post-calving? Is there any way you could make up? I know you talked about upregulating PTH and vitamin D with low calcium, negative DCAD, but if you do it the other way around, can you make it up with your post-calving nutrition?
Yeah, Razak, I think what the Florida study shows us unequivocally is that you cannot.
Okay.
I don't think you could. The diets post-calving in Florida were really appropriate diets.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you could actually cover for the problems. The problems were really profound with a positive DCAD and just cholecalciferol. So those animals really did have a lot more metabolic problems and a lot more disease. And because that occurs virtually at the time of calving, you're already in trouble. So there's nothing you can really do to overcome it. And I think that's why the transition period is so critical, is that, unfortunately, if you mess it up, then you pay for it for an entire lactation.
Yeah.
Or the animal pays for it with its life. It's a really pivotal time.
Yeah. Good. Thanks for that. The second question is about the amino acid nutrition. You indicated some positive response to amino acid nutrition. Is there any specific amino acid we should be looking at?
Well, we've got some papers in at the moment on that area, and in terms of amino acid nutrition, the methionine seems to be very important. But,
Mhm.
there was a good talk on the Nutritionist I'd recommend to you that came from Mark Hannigan, and, as Mark points out, that area is now, I think, getting considerable attention, and the old concept of a single rate limiting amino acid probably isn't appropriate. We are looking at, needing to consider a suite of amino acids and how they interact to give a good positive overall response. So, yeah, that's probably my recommendation, is to think about a total package of amino acids. But, for example, the European studies with silage, ryegrass silages, particularly histidine may have been limiting in some of those studies. But, again, it's complex. Really recommend that you maybe have a look at when those papers come out, and they might provide a little bit more guidance. But also have a listen to that webinar.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, thanks for that.
Okay, and Razak, that actually is up as a recorded webinar that you can download. Hello. So I do have perhaps a comment or a question from Jose Hiram Menendez Ramirez in Mexico. He says transition cows are fed straw. And I'm not sure if he was continuing that or if it was more of a, this is how we control our intake.
Yeah, look, a common strategy on some of the pasture-fed herds is to feed a lot of straw. And that controls your risk of milk fever. And it's pretty simple. Why do you control your risk of milk fever? Well, if you don't get much milk, you don't have much risk of milk fever. And that comes back to the whole strategy about not just solving one thing. So, this presentation is a pretty damn complex presentation when you think about it, because we're trying to optimize about 10 different things. But fundamentally we are still trying to get those 4 freedoms. And if you think about the freedom from lipid mobilization disorders, straw doesn't kind of fit that if it's a substantial part of the diet. You just can't get the energy density, you can't get the protein, you don't get the milk. So some straw is fine. We use a little bit of straw at times, especially in drought, when there's a drought and there's less other forage available. So we'll use a little straw then. But, bottom line is we would prefer to avoid using straw, and that's why we use good quality cereal hays. But again, we test those hays as often as we can to make sure they don't have too much potassium in there and that they're not too high in DCAD. So the straws won't give you that problem, but they will not also at times give you milk if they're too dominant in the diet.
Yeah. He says he did expand upon it. In Mexico, very often transition cows are fed with straw or other forages high in calcium. How do you achieve the goal of DCAD required in that situation?
Yeah, and I think it's just doing a proper dietary strategy. It can be part of the diet, but just don't let it overwhelm, and you need to find some lower calcium sources. So if you're talking about high calcium straws, you need to find some other feeds to go with that are lower in calcium.
Okay. I think that we may be at the end of our questions. So it's almost noon for you at this point, probably.
10:08.
Okay. All right. Very good. Well, it's starting to get dark here. So thank you again for joining us. And I will, for everybody listening, I will end up sending you a link to the recording that will be in the raw form tomorrow. But if you want the PDF, request it from me through an email. I will be working on the recording and getting it up on our website during the course of the next month. Dr. Lean, thank you very much for joining us. Attendees and co-hosts, thank you. And I hope that everybody has a good month.
Thanks, Marianne.
Yep. Goodbye.
Thanks all for attending.